Well, good afternoon from Boston and good morning to those of you dialing in from further west. I'm Erik Lin-Greenberg, an assistant professor at MIT and a fellow with the Bridging the Gap project. And on behalf of the entire BTG team, I'd like to welcome you to our publishing and policy writing panel, which is our first substantive event as part of our virtual format New Era workshop. Before I dive in, really want to thank our panelists, who I'll introduce in just a minute, for taking the time out of their schedules to join us today. To all of our attendees, I know that you're likely in the midst of submitting job market materials or teaching, trying to learn how to teach via Zoom and taking classes, so thanks to you. And also thank you to our Bridging the Gap headquarters team, Layla and Catherine, for organizing this, and to our directors and my fellow fellows, including Danny Gilbert, who's celebrating a birthday today, for making today's event possible. And it'd also be remiss if I didn't thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their generous support that allows us to organize these sessions. So I think under normal circumstances, in pre-COVID times, we would be sitting on the campus of the American University School of International Service and holding this panel, which is one of my favorite events from the New Era workshop. And so we've done our best to recreate the panel, essentially in a virtual format. And to do that, we have this incredible lineup of editors and scholars, and I'm really, really excited to learn from them today. So what we'll do today is I'll pose a few questions after introducing the speakers to set the stage, but I'll do my best to leave at least an hour or so for Q&A. And during the Q&A, I think we're a small enough group just to use your blue hands. So for those, most people should know how to do this, but just press the participants button and then raise your blue hand, and I'll do my best to direct traffic. Just two small caveats. The first is if you're not speaking, if we can ask you to turn off your mics, that'd be great. And then the second is this is being recorded. If anyone has any issues with that, just email Catherine or I, and we'll make sure that we don't post it. So that being said, let me introduce our absolutely incredible panel of speakers. We have some scholars, we have editors, some folks that do both, and just really, really excited to have them here with us today. So Autumn Brewington was an editor with the Washington Post from 2001 to 2014. From 2007 to 2014, she was the editor of the Post op-ed page. And after that, Autumn joined the Wall Street Journal, where she launched a vertical on Washington politics and policy and ran that for more than 2 years. In 2017 and 2018, she was a visiting editor for Lawfare, a blog that many of you are familiar with that writes on national security and legal affairs. And she's back editing for the Post opinion section and occasionally writes about British royalty. Jim Golby is a senior fellow at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin and a lecturer in the Department of Government. He's also co-host of the Center for Strategic and International Studies' Thank You for Your Service podcast. And before joining UT Austin, Jim served 20 years in the United States Army, including assignments from the tactical to strategic levels. He served as a defense policy advisor at the U.S. mission to NATO, a special advisor to the vice president, as a special assistant to the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, and as an assistant professor of American politics at West Point. Jim holds a PhD from Stanford in political science and is currently working on a book project that examines the determinants of public confidence in the US military. E.J. Graff, who many of you are familiar with, is a journalist, author, commentator, speaker, and editor whose award-winning reporting and commentary examines social ills in our political landscape from various angles: academic, investigative, analytic, sociological, historical, legal, and human. She's known for her witty and informed insight on a wide range of subjects, especially gender, sexuality, politics, and family, but also makes forays into issues like terrorism, the death penalty, beach towns, and blizzards. Currently, EJ is serving as the managing editor of The Monkey Cage at the Washington Post, which brings political science research into public discussion. Doyle Hodges is the executive editor of Texas National Security Review. And prior to TNSR, Doyle taught at the United States Naval War College and also served as a visiting research fellow in the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the United States Naval Academy. Doyle's a retired naval officer who commanded 2 ships and earned a doctorate in security studies from Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He studies a variety of issues, including grand strategy, civil military relations, ethics and international affairs, and military innovation. Last but certainly not least is Tanvi Madan. She's a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Foreign Policy Program and director of the India Project at the Brookings Institution. Tanvi's work explores India's role in the world and its foreign policy, focusing in particular on India's relations with China and the United States. She's the author of the book Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War, and is currently completing a monograph on India's foreign policy diversification strategy. Tanvi holds a PhD in public policy from the University of Texas at Austin, where she was also a Harrington Doctoral Fellow and teaching assistant. So we've got just an incredible group of scholars with us today. And what I want to start by doing is asking the editors to spend maybe 5-6 minutes telling us a little bit about their respective publications and really how early stage researchers can best contribute. And with that, I will ask Autumn to start off.
Like being at the front of the alphabet. So these days, this year, I've been editing for The Post again, and I apologize if that was my computer that made that noise. I think one thing that, we're sort of really keeping an eye out for is smart, accessible content. So when researchers see things in the news that really are connected to areas where they know a lot and can offer insights that, everyday audiences might not necessarily be aware of, we're looking for pieces that can take a smart audience that is not necessarily as educated on a particular topic and walk them through, here are the important implications of X action, or this upcoming election, or this particular military decision, or this event that happened in a far-flung country. This is how it relates back to US national security, or etc. Mostly these days I'm editing op-eds, but I think that there are some things that apply just as much to sort of 800-word pieces as they do to longer, more academic articles. You kind of need to bring the reader along with you. You need to say upfront where the column or paper is going to go. You need to write it in a way that really anybody can understand it. So hopefully with not a lot of jargon, but just actually telling you these are the important things. I think a lot of academic writing kind of tends to build toward the most important point, whether you're writing an op-ed or a slightly longer form paper. Before you send a submission somewhere, you should really look at it and try to figure out, is your most powerful paragraph the very last one? You want to put your most concise, strong statement at the very beginning. I think the thing that I stress to writers, like if you take away nothing, if you consider this the boldface type statement, don't give editors or other readers a reason to not keep going. So don't start with, as history records happened 5,000 years ago. Like, they're not going to know why that's relevant to today. Or if you start with kind of a very sort of dense, though familiar to a particular circle, like reference, sometimes that can just be really hard to get readers beyond that point. And I think especially at a time when everyone is so busy, it's important to just let people know in an intelligent way from the very beginning where your article is going to go. Why is it relevant to this particular publication? You've probably heard of something called the elevator pitch, where you're supposed to be able to say in about 3 sentences, what is your piece about? When you're emailing your pitch someplace, you need to also be able to say in just a few sentences, here's my idea, here's my expertise, here's why this is important for your audience to hear this particular thing, why I'm the right person to tell it. I think sometimes it can be hard to sort of grasp, or it kind of almost seems like it's counterintuitive somehow. Like it's not necessarily dumbing something down to make it accessible. What you're trying to do is explain sometimes very complicated issues to an intelligent audience that just doesn't know as much about the topic as you do. So like if you were explaining it, say, to your parent or your cousin, or pick a particular person who is smart but just doesn't necessarily have the same expertise that you do, and then imagine telling that person, here's why this thing is significant. That's the thing that you should be writing. And I think there are probably several other editors on this call who are familiar with, sometimes you get a pitch and the pitch is sort of more interesting and exciting than the draft itself comes in as. Like, we still want that, you know, excitement in the draft, but we also just want to look at drafts that are accessible. And, you know, it's really exciting. Like, you're doing research that you can point to things in history that are, you know, relevant to things that are happening today. You know, I think speak up as soon as you can and email editors and say, hey, I have this thing and here's why you should pay attention to it. But just as much as you can make it accessible and kind of clear from the very beginning, and put your strongest statement at the beginning, because you never know if someone is going to read all the way to the end. Honestly, I had another editor say to me yesterday, you and I are the only two people who are getting paid to read this story. And that's kind of the problem. Like, when I'm getting paid to read a story, I continue to read it to the end. But if a reader struggles with something, especially if they're reading on a device, they could just click away. So you want to be able to, you know, keep them interested and keep the text moving along so that they do get to the end and get all of the insights that you're trying to convey. Is that helpful?
That was wonderful, and I'm sure that probably sparks several questions that folks will, you know, follow up on later. So thank you.
Okay.
EJ, I want to turn it over to you and your work at the Monkey Cage.
Let me start out by saying that I think Autumn said everything that's important. So just go back and listen again to what she said. She is exactly on target with every word. I'll just say it differently. Here, I'm gonna give you my screen because I am nerdy enough to have made a presentation. Here we go. So if you're writing for us, The Monkey Cage, which is a somewhat problematic title and we are working on replacing it, but that is a process. So anyway, I'm going to assume you all know The Monkey Cage. I'm going to call it TMC. All right, let's see. What is it? There we go. So before you pitch, read the guidelines. Do exactly what they ask. We all put in the guidelines exactly what we're looking for. And I know we all get pitches that seem to have never noticed that we are not doing the thing that they are pitching. Don't be that person. Be the person who has read the guidelines and responds exactly. So here I put up on the screen the bit.lys that we have for our guidelines. I can't tell you how many emails I write back saying, thank you for thinking of us with your work. As you know, from reading our guidelines, and I put these links in, we don't publish that. So we want you, but be sure you're giving us what we can run. Be sure you're familiar with the outlet itself, right? You have a great idea. I'm just gonna count on that because you're all spending your lives studying really urgent things. But where should it go? You may want to get in TMC or the Washington Post op-ed page or whatever it is, but is the piece you have in mind for that piece. So you should know something about how they usually write. And then search to see before you pitch, has that outlet already covered this? And if they have, is your piece different enough that you can articulate what the difference is? I mean, if they covered it 3 years ago, never mind. But if they just published something this morning, dang, your piece, you should be able to articulate how it's different and note that they just published something. Okay, so how to pitch. We, in that About the Monkey Cage page, bit.ly TMC about, we go over a lot of our guidelines, but these are the 3 things we ask for in a pitch. What's the news? We know your research is fascinating no matter what, but why is it fascinating today? What can it explain that just happened in the debate or whatever, wherever your area of the world is? Kyrgyzstan, there's fighting in Kyrgyzstan. One of our favorite places ever because my fellow editor can't ever spell it. So I like to tease her about it. Fighting just erupted. Nobody's pitched us on that. So how can you explain the fighting there? What is the research you're going to mention? It's great if you can tell us that it's your research. We also want to know that you know the surrounding research, so you're not just writing about what you know. And then tell us how your post is going to change what people think about this topic. What is it they don't know that they really ought to know to understand it better? Other outlets are similarly specific, do exactly what they ask. Okay, so here's what we look for. Researched and informed analysis that explains current news. This is what I just said, but I said it a different way. Synthesizes and translates current political science. And we are especially looking, we are always looking for contributions from people from historically marginalized groups or that are about neglected topics in the news that really need to be illuminated from a different perspective. So we want you. Here's what we reject. Op-eds, we do not run op-eds. You're probably learning here how to write an op-ed, and that's important. There's many outlets for that, and people, that's the most popular part of a newspaper often, but we don't run it. We do research and informed analysis. So if there's the word should in your pitch, take it out. Or if you have some heavy duty adjective or adverb that says that's appalling, it's going. Summaries of your research. So sometimes I get a pitch saying, I just published a paper on blah, blah, blah. I would like to explain this to your readers. Well, I'm sure the paper is important and makes a big contribution to the field, but unless it's summarizing something that happened in the last 2 days or explaining something that's happened in the last week or that is ongoing, we're not going to run it. And we also don't want writing that's aimed at other academics, right? While most scholars believe blah, blah, our paper shows blah, blah. We kind of suggest that you imagine that you're trying to explain your subject to a smart biology student undergrad who is taking your class. And she's going to catch on, she's motivated, that's why she's taken the class, but she doesn't know what a confidence interval is. Like, I don't know, do biology students know confidence intervals? I don't know the answer to that. I don't, though. And I've been editing at the Monkey Cage for years now, and I'm still like, it's an interval that you have confidence in. I have no idea what it means. No, you need to explain to me or to the biology student or to your political aunt what it is that you're trying to say. And we also don't run responses to pieces that we've run that we'd only be publishing things from unhappy people. Your audience doesn't know your subject, cares about the world, wants to understand puzzling or important events. This is important. We get traffic not because somebody comes to the Monkey Cage and reads everything we have. We get traffic because somebody types in, what happens if a candidate dies before the election? It just so happens we published a piece with that title, and that has been getting 1,000 hits a day. And over the weekend, something happened and suddenly it got 600,000 hits because that's all anybody wanted to know. Like, wait, what if either of them, what if both of them get COVID and die? So that's how they come to read your piece. They want to know what's happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, or they don't, and so they don't Google it. And also, they're reading on their phones. So really intricate little figures, it's not going to happen. 2/3 of our readers are reading on their phones. So we're going to break your prose down into very short sentences. Some of you have had this experience where I took a machete to your sentences, and it just helps with readability on the phone. Have I used up all my time? I can stop now.
If you want to take another minute or two, that'd be good.
Okay, so Autumn said this essentially, but you want to start out not with 5,000 years ago, blah. You want to start out by saying, because 5,000 years ago, blah, therefore Trump is our president. Make someone go, wait, what? Huh? And then you can drop back and explain to us the 5,000-year-old thing, and later in the next section, explain how that made Trump president. But just the info isn't going to do it. You got to start with a provocative claim, a bold question, startling juxtaposition, a moving story. Here are some of my favorite first lines ever. And the second one isn't so exciting, but at least it starts with something, an interesting claim. And that's good for democracy. Wait, what? Wait, what is a great thing to have your reader do? Wait, what? Then they're willing to keep reading. As you write, use handrails. In academic writing, you are used to going, rightly so, into great detail on every small thing. They are not all equal in a piece for public consumption. You need to take a breath like every paragraph and say, okay, here's what you're going to learn now. Here's why this is important. So right, and you're going to link. And then this is your basic strunk and white, which I am hoping you have all memorized by now. Omit needless words. Get rid of them. We don't need to say rectify when we mean fix. Okay, these are some edits that I actually did. They're all going to seem possible to you guys if I've edited you. Right? Avoided, I puzzled over that phrase for so long. Avoided characterizing the whoa, this is what he's saying. That's what it ended up being. Boom, do it fast. We're not reading long sentences, short sentences, active verbs, and just get rid of all the filler. You can do it. If not, we'll do it for you. But you make us really happy when you get rid of the filler before you send it. All right, that's it. That's all I got. Thank you.
Thanks so much, EJ. So our last two panelists really were talking about shorter form outlets. I want to pivot now to a slightly longer form outlet in the Texas National Security Review. Doyle, over to you.
Thanks. Well, much like EJ began by saying what Autumn said, I absolutely have to begin by saying what EJ and Autumn said. And probably the most important thing of what EJ said that I can't emphasize enough is please read the outlet and read the submissions guidance. I cannot count the number of interesting, well-written, thoughtful articles that are simply not a good fit for the outlet that I receive. And I know it's disheartening when you receive that feedback, when you've sent something in, it represents your intellectual labor, you're proud of it, and justly so, and you get told, no, this doesn't go on my refrigerator. But it's an avoidable problem. It also, there's the other option, and this is one that I've encountered, and ironically, it seems to happen more often with junior scholars than with senior. You might think that a senior scholar would be the ones who would have the perspective of their importance that would enable them to do this. But if you're beginning your pitch with, I know you don't publish this, but, stop. Send it to the outlet that does publish it. It's not that it's not a good piece, but especially if you're a junior scholar, what you're really saying is, you know, this outlet that you believe is focused on X really ought to be focused on Y, and take my word for it. No, it isn't that we don't think work of type Y has value. It's that that's not the niche that this outlet is filling. So yeah, the notion of reading the submissions guidance, of reading the outlet so that you know that what you're doing fits with what they do is critically important. So I'm actually going to talk about TNSR, but I'm going to talk very briefly about War on the Rocks first, just because War on the Rocks is part of the same family of publications. But once again, in terms of understanding the differences, it's a very different type of publication from TNSR, and it probably falls somewhere in between what EJ does at Monkey Cage and what Autumn does with op-eds, because TNSR is sort of mid-length policy analysis pieces done by people with a background that gives them policy expertise. Policy analysis aren't op-eds. Occasionally, War on the Rocks will run commentaries, but for the most part, they are insightful policy analyses that will come up with recommendations, but which are not intended to be op-ed pieces and aren't intended to be academic journal pieces. So that's War on the Rocks. War on the Rocks does ask for a pitch first. The guidance for the pitches is contained in submissions guidance. And again, everything that EJ and Autumn told you, have a lead, something that grabs the attention. Be able to summarize the argument in 1 or 2 sentences. I know you're not going to get all the nuance in 1 or 2 sentences. That's fine. You should be able to summarize the broad argument quickly enough and then explain why your background qualifies you to write it. If you can put that into a pitch for War on the Rocks, it's likely, assuming that the piece has interest and isn't something that's been overdone on that publication, that the editors will say, yeah, let's please see the pitch and we'll move forward from there. TNSR is a different publication from War on the Rocks. It is an academic journal that also focuses on policy. And so we publish 3 types of pieces. We publish scholarly articles, which are peer-reviewed articles that make a scholarly argument in the sense that it has to have something new about it, whether that's new evidence, a new interpretation, a new framework, that deal with a topic broadly related to national security with some implication for policy. We're interdisciplinary. We don't have a preference for or against any discipline or methodology. Because we do seek to be accessible in what we write with much the same audience in mind as EJ mentioned, although I've always sort of envisioned it as a Senate staffer, someone who is very bright, very capable, likely has an undergraduate degree, no advanced training in statistics, and is confronted with a whole bunch of issues, but wants to learn some issues in depth in order to support their boss in their job. Because of that, we ask that if you use statistical quantitative methods, that you present them in a way that doesn't require formal statistical training to understand. So regression analysis is fine. There are lots of ways to present and interpret the results of regression analysis other than in a regression table. If you give me a regression table, I'm going to say, well, first of all, as I'm reviewing it, I'm going to think, okay, this is a person who didn't read our submissions guidance carefully because we specifically say, please don't use regression tables. But I'm also going to say, how can I express this in a way that someone who has never been trained as to what a p-value is can look at it, understand that 3 asterisks is different than 1 asterisk, which is different from no asterisks, and all this sort of thing. I mean, if you think about the first time you saw one of these, it's not an intuitive format. It's not something that jumps out and tells someone who is smart and interested but lacks that training what they should take away from it. But there are ways you can do so. We're not opposed to confidence intervals. And in fact, graphs of confidence intervals are actually one very useful way to show, okay, this is the degree to which we believe this is likely to occur without using things like regression tables. Strategist pieces. Strategist pieces are distinguished from scholarly pieces, not by their length. I have a lot of people who believe that, oh, well, this is 4,000 words, so it's a strategist piece. Now, please, again, read the submissions guidance. They're distinguished by who's writing it. Strategist pieces are written by someone who has experience implementing or developing policy relevant to the topic on which they're writing. All 3 of those are important. I've had military officers who served in one area want to send an article in about something else entirely, arguing, well, it's a strategist piece because I'm a military officer. Well, no, but there's nothing about your experience as an intelligence officer that would give you insight into the role of Herb Lauterpacht in developing international law in the United Nations Charter. I'm sorry. If you were a JAG officer who'd worked with this, I could give you some credit there, but otherwise, this is going to have to stand on its legs as a scholarly article in terms of what it goes forward as. And then we publish roundtables. Roundtables are solicited input. So we do have people reach out to us and suggest roundtables. A number of people who are participating in this discussion have published roundtable articles with us. In fact, Hillary, who is on here, is actually putting together a roundtable for us where she's shepherding it through. One of the things that I'm cognizant of as a journal editor is the fact that since roundtable articles are not peer-reviewed, that for a junior scholar, the return on investment on roundtable articles is a little bit difficult to justify for a hiring or a tenure committee. And so while I will not turn away a junior scholar working on a roundtable point blank, I will make sure that a junior scholar is aware of that risk because I don't want them to go in spending time and get told, well, I have no idea what this is. This doesn't count for what I'm looking for from you. I think Hillary's example is a terrific one where she is using this as a way to connect, to put together, to put forward a number of voices in her field. And so it helps to advance the work that she's doing, as well as to build her network and community and to gain more traction for it. And I'm happy to support that sort of thing. I just want to make sure no one comes into it and comes out with a sense of disappointment that they thought they were going to get one thing and they got something else when they were done with it. The things that I'll add to the already excellent advice that's been given in terms of the writing. Jargon has already been discussed, but I can't emphasize enough how difficult it is to understand what is and isn't jargon when you are immersed inside the world you're writing from. And to use an example that I think is probably familiar to most of us here, think back to the first time you were sitting in a seminar and someone said to a speaker, you have an endogeneity problem. And I will tell you that in my case, I had no idea what endogeneity was. I thought it might be some sort of skin condition. When someone says your causal arrow is going in the wrong direction, I can understand that, right? But it's really difficult sometimes when you're in the midst of it to understand what is and isn't jargon. But I strongly, strongly encourage you to go through and to ruthlessly look for the simplest way to express it, but no simpler. I'm not asking you to lose nuance. I'm not asking you to lose academic rigor. I am asking you to use the clearest, plainest language possible to describe these complex concepts in ways that the people who are making the policy and often lack the specialized training that the academics have can understand and make best use of the findings that we have. And that's what bridging the gap is about, right? It's about being able to translate this arcane world that, some people compare to a priesthood of this sort of, shepherds of the knowledge, and to make it available to others in a way where it's meaningful and can have an impact. Another thing that I've seen people have a tendency to do is to write inductively. They want to put everything together and then build to the big reveal, the Agatha Christie moment at the end, where suddenly it all pulls together and they tell you what the article is or what the argument is. And I will confess that, certainly as I was initially writing in grad school, I was guilty of this enormously. And it wasn't until I had a professor sit me down and say, I had to get to the last paragraph to understand what you were trying to tell me, that I realized where the challenge with that is. So please telegraph your argument up front, signpost it along the way. What this allows the reader to do on a long form piece is to work along with you. You've told them where you're going, and as they're reading, they're now evaluating, yeah, I see how this supports the point that they're making. Instead of coming into the end going, oh, wow, I missed the fact that this was here and now it all ties together. That's not the goal. The goal is to bring them with you in this persuasive argument as you move forward, so that when they're done with it, they understand. If they don't agree with your conclusion, they at least understand why you believe your conclusion is plausible and correct, and understand the basis for it, or understand where they disagree. So I can't emphasize enough, please make sure that you're writing in a way that telegraphs and signposts your argument so that it's as easy as possible for the reader to go along with you. And then the last thing, as a journal that seeks to be policy relevant, the question is, what is policy relevant? How do you make something policy relevant? And here I would say, there's a temptation to think that unless it is ripped from the headlines, that it can't be policy relevant. And certainly for EJ's work, the headlines are incredibly important, right? But for TNSR, some of the best policy relevant articles we've published, we had one by Phil Zellico on the decision to occupy the Philippines in 1898. This is not something that's ripped from today's headlines. But what he did was to use this as a study of the factors that compelled the president to make a policy choice that ran counter to his desires, and how those factors culminated in doing something other than what he would have expected to do. We had another piece about Shakespeare's Coriolanus and the education of a grand strategist. Again, this, you don't think to yourself immediately, yeah, Coriolanus, of course it's policy relevant. But again, it used the characters from Coriolanus as familiar tropes in order to draw types of influences and schools of thought that shape the way in which grand strategy is formed, This engaged with things like realist thought, engaged with constructivist thought. It brought all these things together, and it used this as a really salient and accessible tool to do it. So what I'll tell you is there's hardly any topic at all that cannot be made policy relevant. But there are also topics that seem immediately policy relevant that can be presented in such a way where the narrowness of the argument and the conclusion mean that there's no particular reason why that Senate staffer would want to pick it up and read it. And that doesn't mean it's not a valuable argument. It may make a terrific contribution to the scholarly literature. But if I can't explain how a Senate staffer is going to think differently on this topic when they're done in a way that's meaningful and allowing them to support their boss, then it's probably not a great fit for TNSR. So that's, I think that probably covers the major things that I wanted to hit. I'm sure there'll be more, but boy, I can't emphasize enough the importance of what Autumn and EJ said in terms of please read the outlet, please read the submissions guidelines, please be as simple as possible, and please try to make sure that you're writing in a way that is hooked in there. Now, and again, as simple as possible in a long form piece like TNSR doesn't mean, I don't have to be as ruthless as EJ does in cutting something down to a 1,200 word piece. I have the option to develop much more complex things. Now, with that said, if you're not Victor Hugo or William Jennings Bryan, be careful about how many semicolons you're using, because it probably means that you're not doing it in the best, most concise way that you can. If you have these ticks, I had an article that came in at 27,000 words. The version that was finally published was 22,000 words. That's above our published length guidance. It was a really good article, but I cut 600 words by searching and deleting the word indeed. So it's entirely possible that you're doing things that make your piece longer than it needs to be, and those don't contribute to a reader going through and taking the most from it.
Thanks so much, Doyle. So we've heard from several editors, and what I want to do now is to pivot to folks who are writing for these outlets, and that's Jim and Tanvi. And what I want to ask is really how you view these various forms of policy-facing writing, whether it's short form outlets, longer form outlets, as part of your broader research agendas. I think, at least in my case, and I know for many others, I often struggle with kind of how I should balance traditional scholarly publishing with writing for policy outlets. So we'd love to hear from your best practices and lessons learned. So over to you, Jim, first.
Great, thanks so much. I will begin, as everyone else has, by saying you should absolutely listen to the things that Autumn and EJ and Doyle have told you, but I'm not going to try to recreate the same type of advice, and hopefully I'll be coming from a little different angle that you might find helpful. Before I go into the question Eric asked me to answer, the one thing that I do want to tell you is that you have important things to say, and your research does have policy relevance. And I just want to let you know, everyone has imposter syndrome. Everyone has doubts about whether their work is good enough. And I'm just here to tell you that your work is good enough, it is relevant, and you should take the risk to put yourself out there. I'm happy to talk about that more later if we want, but believe in yourself, because the research you're doing is excellent, and it can have an important impact. When it comes to how I think about sort of popular publishing with my research agenda, I think the most important thing for me is that it's not an either-or proposition, but there are certain priorities that you have to think about in terms of what your incentive structures are. If you are someone who does want to pursue a tenure track career in academia, your incentives are going to line up differently than someone who primarily sees themselves as having a career in the policy community. Neither one of those is right or wrong, but you need to think carefully about which of those you want to do and how you weight your research. One thing that I will say as I plan out my research agenda, and for those of you who don't know, I'll just real quickly summarize sort of the main strands I'm working on right now. One is a project that looks at public views of American institutions with a particular focus on the military, and it asks a lot of questions about why we have confidence in some institutions, why we don't have confidence in other institutions, and why that might be important for democratic accountability. The second strand has to do with the impact of elite statements on foreign policy. This has to do a lot with in particular, when military officials or cabinet officials make statements that the public hears, how does that change the way the public hears about it? And then I'm also doing some other work on strategy and how you can effectively do strategy in practice. So that's sort of my broad research agenda. But one thing I'll say is most of the time, my research is guided first and foremost by the scholarly research questions that I want to ask. And I write those things and I design my research based on the idea that I want to get my research published in academic journals. And sometimes it will be, aiming for a more elite journal like an APSR. Sometimes it'll be aiming for something more like Armed Forces and Society that speaks to a particular community. But I do come to my research with the primary question of obtaining new knowledge and learning something that we didn't know before about the world. But whenever I do that, I also come at it from the standpoint of, is there a way that I can communicate those ideas in a policy relevant way that would complement the scholarly research I'm doing? Now, for every piece, I do make decisions about whether or not it's worthwhile for me to pursue something that's short form or long form. And I would say I err more toward the sort of mid form and short form that Doyle talked about, sort of War on the Rocks on down, maybe occasionally foreign affairs on down. But I generally don't aim to do things like the Washington Quarterly or some of the other quasi-academic journals that aren't peer reviewed, but that would also require a similar amount of effort to producing a peer-reviewed piece. For me, it's just the bang for the buck isn't there, and it's not necessarily the audience that I want to target with my work. Primarily what I want to do is share the insights that I have from the research that I'm doing with a broader community, and I want to think carefully about what that audience is. Sometimes it's a policy community, sometimes it's the public at large, but I try to be intentional about which of those I'm going to do up front. You're going to get a very different audience if you write in the monkey cage than if you write in lawfare. You're going to get a different audience if you write in War on the Rocks versus Just Security. We think there's a lot of overlap, but there are different people with different backgrounds reading these types of outlets, and you should try to think about who's going to read your piece and who you want to read your piece before you publish it. To follow up on sort of my idea that you plan when you do your research. So right now, I'm actually getting a survey back from the field today that is a study of public confidence in institutions. Now, when we designed the research, we did this with the expectation that we would basically produce a book project, probably with a few scholarly articles. But as we made decisions about what experiments we were going to run, we also thought about what topics were relevant in American society right now and how our research might speak to those. So we have some questions about the Insurrection Act that we added in and how military statements for or against the Insurrection Act might impact public opinion. Now, that allows us to get at this policy question that we care about, the underlying issue of military statements and the statements that people like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff make and how it impacts policy. But it also gives us a hook that we can then go back and possibly pitch to an outlet that they might find it more attractive than if we just did sort of a more generic experiment. So when we designed our experiment, we tried to think, are there ways that we can hook this to a broader audience that still accomplish our research objective? And we did that pretty intentionally. And hopefully, we'll see, hopefully we'll have a few pieces coming out in the next week that will complement our longer term book project. The last thing I'll say, let me say two things, I guess. The first is that based on everything that the editors told you, it's important to realize that grad school did not prepare you to do the kind of writing that you're going to do. I still struggle with it at times. You're going to have to practice. And with that practice, even if you do all the things that they told you, you're going to get rejections. All of us get rejections. It's part of the process. Sometimes it's just not the right fit, the right time. And you've just got to be able to roll with the punches and make smart decisions about when you're going to take those risks. It is totally normal for, in some cases, me to pitch a piece 2 or 3 places before it gets picked up, or in some cases to pitch a piece, pitch in another place and just decide, I don't have time to keep going on this. I've got other things I need to focus on. And so being intentional about how much time you can give away to a piece and sort of cutting your losses after you get to a certain mark is important. The last thing I'll say, and it may seem counterintuitive, but I think the more I've published, the more I've realized that networking actually is really important to this. As good as your pitches can be, sometimes if you know the right person and they know the work you're doing, they'll come to you and say, hey, I'd really like you to write us a piece about X topic. And that's because they're aware of you, they know what you're doing, and they have a particular need that they want to fill based on the news cycle. And that's just not something you're going to get through a pitch. The other good thing about networking is it allows you to have other people you can count on and trust to look at your pieces before you send them out. And sometimes, you think you've written something really great, and then you send it to a few people and they're like, I really don't get where you're going at. And if you can fix those problems before you send them to an editor, your chances of publication increase pretty significantly. The other thing I would say about networking is if you think about this both as being a good colleague, so someone who's going to promote other people's work, as well as potentially having the opportunity to promote yourself, I think there really are opportunities for you to grow in ways that you just don't expect. So when I got involved on Twitter, I never would have imagined all the relationships that I formed, all the people who give me advice, all the people who give me feedback when I throw out, just sort of random topics or tweets. I really do learn and grow from that engagement. And I think it's important to have that broader network of people who are interested in the same things you are, who you can trust, and who can give you feedback and lift each other up. Because sometimes when you're getting told no all the time, it can get a little frustrating, and it's good to have other people who are going through it too. So I'll stop right there.
Thanks so much, Jim. Just before turning to Tanvi, we've got a quick two-finger from Doyle.
Thanks. Jim, your comment about grad school not preparing you to write the types of papers you need to do sparked me to remember something I had meant to put out and didn't. And it probably is less applicable for this audience, but it's applicable for you in your role as colleagues and mentors to your friends. I had submitted probably 3 grad school papers to journals, each one of which was rejected, as I realized later appropriately, because they were great syntheses of the existing scholarship with a couple of conclusions, but there was absolutely nothing novel about what they did in terms of their scholarship. They were not good journal articles. They probably would have been good edited volume chapters, but they weren't good journal articles. And I can tell you that my grad school experience at 3 different grad schools did nothing at all to educate me on what the difference between a good grad school paper and a good journal article was. So the fact that you're here and at this point, you probably know this already, but it's really helpful to communicate that to folks as they get excited about having done the work and done this sort of stuff, to say, hey, if you want to submit this and you have a good framework, you need to figure out how you're going to make an original contribution to the scholarship. It's not enough just to synthesize what's out there. And once I figured that out, it felt a lot better. I started getting fewer rejections, but until I did, I was just baffled at these jerks who didn't appreciate my work nearly as much as my professors did.
Thanks, Doyle. And Tanvi, last but not least again, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Eric. And I'm glad that I can clean up after these excellent comments. And I'll echo some of them. And I will start by saying, a couple of things. There'll be some overlap with what Jim said, but particularly about kind of the incentive structures, that you will have different incentive structures. And it's harder when you are torn about whether you want to kind of go for a tenure track job or you're interested in a policy job. But there's a way of striking that balance. It's sometimes more time intensive, but it can be struck. And I think there are increasingly a number of people who you look around and you say, oh, I'm not the only one out there who wants to try to kind of balance both. But also I think Jim's point about how he approaches research is in many ways the way I do as well. So I work at a think tank. I think of it as my job to do academically rigorous, policy relevant research. Now, Brookings is still unusual in the sense that we still do books. You're encouraged, scholars in our foreign policy program are encouraged to be working on a book at any given time. And that is what I do on a day-to-day basis. My primary audience at the end of the day is kind of an audience that's interested in this policy relevant work. Now that could be, I think of stakeholders broadly. So those are policymakers. Those are, sometimes it's stakeholders in business. Sometimes it's in other think tanks. But I also take the kind of public education part of my job really seriously. And so I want to be able to write for an audience that a piece that I do, or generally most of the pieces I do, will be something that would be useful to a policymaker potentially, but also accessible and something that a student would read, or kind of even a member of the public who's not necessarily engaged on these subjects. I don't often, I mean, while I do think of kind of academic audiences and I like my work to be meeting that quality, I don't often write for journals because my incentive structure, not just institutionally, but especially personally in terms of what Jim mentioned, the investment of time, is just not, for me, it's the turnaround time the journals take. Much of what I'm writing about is a contemporary, even though I'm a historian by training, I'll often find ways to bring kind of that history to the present day moment, what it can teach us, what it cannot teach us, etc., about the present moment. And so for me, a journal article, I'll give you an example. I was at a joint workshop last year run by SOAS and the Foreign Office in England. And it was a very contemporary subject that I was working on. And it made sense for the workshop, but the journal article process is just much longer. So I'm constantly having to update this is what I was doing the last few weeks, constantly having to update that article. And so it's a lot more time. By the time it comes out in the journal, if it does, it'll be, another year from now and I'll have to update it again. So it's just not, it's about kind of what is the best use of your time. And in my case, I do publish sometimes in academic journals, but it's rare. I definitely have stopped publishing book chapters in edited volumes because again, the kind of time and time-bound nature of what I have to do, but also the fact that I'm not sure who's reading those kind of chapters. I think at the same time, like Jim, the way I approach my work is that I want it to be high quality. I wanted to do, and I approach it in the way that I would research, kind of if I was working in academia, how would I approach this? Whether it's in my questions, whether it's in research design, whether it's in methodology. And I think that's important to think about. The only thing is what you'll be dealing with then is different outlets and different ways of expressing those ideas in ways that have been outlined by everybody on the session today. And those are going to be different. And I think it's important, as everybody said, to remember that those are going to be different. Now, in terms of what I do with the research, for me, the outlets are when I'm, say, working on a book right now. So I'm doing in-depth research. I was supposed to be going to archives. That is not quite happening. I'll be interviewing people. I'll be triangulating of the primary and secondary source work. But what I'm going to do with that research is it's not just going to go into a book. What I'm learning from it, what I'm reading on a day-to-day basis, I think of outlets as everything from Twitter at one end to the book on the other and everything in between. And so that will mean, whether it's War on the Rocks, whether it will be shorter kind of blog posts or even op-eds about, 800 words or so. Sometimes you're even asked to do 650 words. And so I tend to be verbose and wordy, so that's always a challenge for me, but I've had to discipline myself to do it. It will be policy briefs, but again, it depends on the audience. So, and it also depends on what you think convey even complex ideas well. So I'll give you an example from just the last 24 hours. There's a quadrilateral ministerial meeting that happened today with Australia, India, Japan, the US. This is something I've written about a lot. I've written about it for War on the Rocks. I wrote a in-depth paper on it for RAND, which was heavily footnoted, etc. Not as many people were going to read that RAND article. I know they're not going to read it. They're not going to have the time. I did 10 or 11 charts that essentially distill that information into a very kind of succinct way. And I know that it will get, much as I kind of resist the idea that will get read more, it will get read more. It will convey my ideas more than that article I put all that time into. But it is based on the research. I could not have done a good job with the charts if I had not done that research. And that's something I think for all of you to remember. I looked at your bios, as Jim said, almost every one of you has, is working on things that are very kind of policy relevant. And I think at the core, what you're doing is in-depth research and analysis, and that is actually what makes, that's your value add. And I think when you're thinking about writing for policy audiences, the typical thing people have often thought about, well, I have to write an op-ed. I don't think that's what you have to do. I think what you're bringing to the table is fresh research, whether that's qualitative, whether that's quantitative. It's updated research and there's new ideas that frankly, some of us who've been kind of, I don't get to kind of engage with academic work as much. I just don't get to read on a day-to-day basis in a way that I would like. I don't get to spend the kind of time I did in the archives. So for me to have somebody who is bringing fresh ideas and research to the table and reading what they're writing is really fresh and insightful. I would say, it's also some things that you can bring to the table are sometimes they're issue areas, and particularly I think if you specialize in particular countries or regions that today aren't in the news, but say you were working on Azerbaijan, suddenly everybody's looking for somebody who knows anything about this and wants to write about what's going on this issue. And so I think you can bring, it doesn't just have to be whatever is the present day, but you have to try to see where that moment is and try to kind of offer up your thoughts in the middle of it. I'll just say a few kind of pointers in terms of how to think about writing to end. I think for one, listen to editors. When you're working, especially on dissertations, you often are the person who knows more about the subject than anybody else in the world. You care about this subject more than anybody else in the world, and you think you know everything. And you're often at, you're very qualified to do what you're doing. And so taking feedback, sometimes it feels very personal, but I can tell you, editors have made me better writers. They made me better writers, and they've made me more accessible to audiences. And so some things, if you feel strongly about, say, look, I want to stick to the way I've conveyed this, if what they're suggesting doesn't convey the ideas you want to represent. But I think I have found that I broadly listen to editors, and I've got better at it over time. I used to be very sensitive and defensive about it. What Jim said as well, second, ask someone to read what you're writing, and particularly if you're writing for policy audiences, ask somebody who might have been on the other side of that, or ask somebody at a think tank, ask somebody who is used to writing for that audience to give it a quick look. I think that's always helpful. Know your audience. You're going to write for different outlets and write in a different way, so you have to decide what that audience is. Finally, on this, I would say, when I think sometimes there's a kind of people feel dissuaded because they say, I have to give policy recommendations, and I don't really, I can't contribute to that. And I would just say, that's not that. If you're going to do policy recommendations, I always remember, and I don't know if the workshop still has required reading, is Alexander George's Bridging the Gap piece. But the thing that stuck with me from that piece is the question of, when thinking about policy, is it not just desirable, is it feasible? So when I'm ever writing about, you should do this, if I'm writing policy recommendations, I will always think, one, is it desirable? Usually yes, because I'm, the whole point is you're suggesting it. Second, is it actually feasible, or is this pie in the sky thing? Third, have people actually tried it? And if they have, why didn't it work out? And four, we don't have access to all this information. So if you can, check if somebody's actually already doing what you're suggesting that they do. And so, I would say approach policy recommendations that way. I will tell you personally in my work, especially as somebody who hasn't served in government, I tend to do more policy analysis and explaining, say, why India doesn't do alliances, for example, rather than policy recommendations, which I don't think is my comparative advantage. I just end by saying it's not an easy balance when you're thinking about how do I split my time, the academic and policy. I think it is a trade-off, and you can't kind of, there's no way to kind of find a perfect world. But I think, that's a personal judgment that each one of you has to make. I do think whether it's because of the number of outlets, Monkey Cage, War on the Rocks, Lawfare, etc., There are far more options today for you to be able to do that work. But sometimes I will say, as somebody who was on faculty recruitment committees, don't expect to be given credit for it when you're going up in academia, but you will get, I think it will bring you a wider audience.
Well, thanks so much to all of the panelists. What I want to do now is to start opening up the floor to questions. So if you want to start putting up your blue hands, that'd be great. And while we wait for folks to put up blue hands, I'm going to ask one question. Both Jim and Tanvi and others mentioned Twitter. And I think one of the things that's unique about policy writing is that a lot more people tend to read policy pieces than academic journal articles. And that can often lead to pretty nasty responses from members of the public who disagree with you. And just wondering if you have any kind of guidance on how you go about responding to that or not responding to that. Tanvi or Jim, feel free, or any of the editors.
Sure. I have found Twitter incredibly useful. I also, since a lot of my Twitter audience is India-based and they're very volatile, I have to deal with, it's kind of trolls that I have to deal with, not other kind of academics who are coming at me. I would say use Twitter for what it is, a valuable tool to gain information, and it is a valuable way to convey your ideas. I have found Twitter threads, for example, both help me distill complex ideas, force me to do that. Also, they come up with a really vast audience. It helps you engage in debates engage in the policy debate in a way that, frankly, especially as junior scholars, it wouldn't have been easy to do in the past. And so it allows you to have a voice, put forth your research, engage with kind of more senior folks in the field. Lots of people, by the way, in government are on Twitter. They will DM you, they do engage. That's how they often find out about your pieces, by the way, especially if you don't have their email addresses. The bad side is what Erik talked about. And so the way I have dealt with this is, I think it's important, for example, not to, when you are, say, somebody's attacking your piece, don't get personal, don't engage similarly, in the sense that don't ignore them if they're people that you want to engage with. Stick by your research. But I don't want to kind of, I guess, paraphrase doing the Michelle Obama thing, when they go low, you go high, which kind of means that, argue with them on your analysis and your facts and your research. Don't get personal. Because I think, to me, I've seen too much of that on Twitter. And I'm also actually horrified, because there are normal people that I see, and you have to ask a question, and this is about your own behavior and how you see others reacting. Would you say this to somebody in person? And if you wouldn't deal with them that way, and hopefully you're not the kind of person who would, but don't start questioning question their arguments, don't question their motivations. Finally, I would say develop a thick skin. This was incredibly hard for me. I take everything very personally, especially my work. And you just have to develop a thick skin. There's no other way. And if you don't have a thick skin, you might not want to be on Twitter.
Yeah, I'll jump in. First, I'm going to say I'm a white male who served 20 years in the military, so my experience will vary from other people's. Even with that caveat, I still get nasty people and trolls all the time. Once my Twitter following, increased into the thousands, I started getting these really horrible DMs. So it is an unfortunate fact, and I don't want to disguise, the reality that many people, especially women and people of color, face. A couple things I would say is Twitter does have tools to help you deal with this, and you should under no circumstances be afraid to use the mute button, the block button, to follow the people you care about, and to not follow the people you don't care about. I will tell you, I have used mute increasingly the longer I am on Twitter, because there are some people that just aren't worth engaging with, and you should not hesitate one moment to mute anyone or block anyone that is, not bringing value to your experience on Twitter. I would say that first thing. Second, when it comes to DMs, do what what you are comfortable with. So there are a number of different settings. Make sure you understand those. That you can completely close those off. You can set them up in a situation where only people who follow you have ability to DM you, or you can have completely open DMs. Depending on what you are comfortable with and what kind of experience you have, make sure you do that, because you will get nasty things and sometimes disturbing things that come in your DMs, probably more for other people than with me, but even I get them. And so make sure you understand the settings and use them. I would completely echo Tanvi's comments. Threads were sort of how I first started using Twitter, and they got a lot of good policy engagement for me, and a lot of people would interact with me and have discussions. They forced me to actually think in ways that made my research more accessible, because I had to contain ideas that built into an argument in a tweet. And I actually thought that was a pretty useful skill. And in some cases, I've actually taken a Twitter thread and with very minimal editing, turned it into an op-ed. So that was a useful skill for me. The last thing I would say is, and I'm not somebody who studies this deeply, but I will say my personal experience is that when you get a lot of criticism on Twitter, you can take it very personally. I do that. I do think it's important to develop a thick skin, but I also think it's important to develop, some limits and boundaries on yourself for when you're going to step away. I am increasingly trying to take, weekends off from Twitter, or only put certain times during the week or weekends when I'm on Twitter, because you really can get sucked into it. Particularly when you publish research. Sometimes when I'll, publish my own research or publish a thread, I will just turn off my Twitter and walk away. And I'll come back to it a couple hours later when I'm not as emotionally engaged, because I do think it can actually hurt your mental health if you allow yourself to be too sucked in. So think about it and set some limits on it. Otherwise, you will find yourself in a position where you feel pretty miserable, because it can have that effect. Perfect. Thanks so much for that. What I want to do is basically collect questions and then have our panelists respond to that. So first off, let's do Emma first, followed by Lincoln. And then once we have their questions, I'll turn it over to the panelists. So go ahead, Emma.
Thank you all for this great discussion. This has been really helpful, and I really appreciate it. Sorry, my camera's off. I had a concussion recently, so I'm not supposed to look at screens. But my question is, particularly for Autumn and EJ, I was wondering if you guys could talk about that timeliness trade-off. Like there's some issues like the South China Sea, et cetera, that in an academic's mind might be always timely, but whether that actually is timely from your perspective, or is that more from the academic perspective? And then a second question is if you all have recommendations on how to interact with journalists who are just asking questions on background and any norms of the road for engaging with them. Thank you all so much.
Perfect. Lincoln, let's get your questions and then we'll turn it over to the panelists.
Hi, so a question I had was, so of course there are several different venues and they all have different ways of submitting pieces, but some of these venues, for instance, I think foreign policy and foreign affairs have this like process where you send it to submittable. And so it feels like as if you're kind of sending it out into this void. And I've had pieces before that they were timely at the time, and then 2 weeks pass and it doesn't appear that anyone has read the piece. And I don't know if you have any advice on kind of how to get around that, or if it's just kind of unfortunate, just kind of a product of the format. So if anyone has any advice on kind of how to get your piece noticed in this kind of empty void, I would greatly appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks. Over to our panelists. I don't know if Autumn and EJ, if you want to jump in first.
I'm happy to try. I'm sure I'll forget. That's 3 questions, so I'm sure I'll forget at least 2. As far at the Monkey Cage, because I've spent so much of my life as a freelance writer, we try and write back to you that day, just saying we got it, and either then saying, sorry, it's not going to work for us right away. And if we can, we give suggestions for other places for you to try submitting it, because we really do want all of you guys to get your work into the public brain. That's, you know, we do have that goal. And we also say, I mean, what I have to do, I'm sort of the air traffic controller. It comes in, I route it somewhere, and then I ask the relevant editors, or it comes to my colleague Vanessa. We share the management of the inbox, because otherwise I was working every day, and that was making me really grumpy, and then I don't respond nicely to you. We then route it to the editors with the appropriate expertise, and we ask them to respond to you. And that can be a black hole, because, you know, we are getting, I got to tell you, since the pandemic started, we have been overwhelmed by submissions. I say this with the most love in my heart that I can send you. You all have way too much time on your hands. I wish that every academic in this country should have a long commute for at least once a day, because we're getting too many submissions. Sorry, did I just go on a rant? No, it's fine, it's all fine. Anyway, if they don't get back to you right away, it's because they got 12 other submissions that they have to sort through. So I always ask you to write back to me in 3 or 4 days, depending on how timely the piece is. Or maybe the next day, it really varies. And remind us, and then we will go back and say, hey, Spencer, remember that piece about blah, blah? What did you guys decide? So we care a lot about getting back to you, and please get back to us if you haven't heard. We've had some problems with spam. Some things are just going straight to spam. Do not use the word virus anywhere in your pitch. Find another way to say it. That goes straight to spam. I mean, it's silly, but it's true. Let's see, that was one. The black hole, oh, I hate those editors. I'm so sorry that's happening to you. But just remember, the same thing is happening to every editor. We are all going to each other. Autumn, I'm assuming this is happening to you guys. We are all going, when does everyone go back to work? They all have way too much time. Please make it stop. We're getting a lot of things. So we are all doing our best. As far as foreign policy or someplace like that, what I would do, because I was, as I say, I was a freelance journalist for a very long time. I have no trouble, please bleep out this word, being an asshole, and finding the name of an editor on the masthead, figuring out what their email address is and writing to them. And then if I still don't hear back, and do it within a few days. I mean, really, if it's timely, do it, because you're going to want to move that piece on. And I will write saying, you know, if I don't hear back by blah, blah, I will assume you're not interested and take it elsewhere. Because that's your intellectual labor matters. And if they can't manage their inbox, that's not your problem. So just go ahead, move it forward. Don't let it get lost if you really do think it's timely. Oh, South China Sea. That South China Sea, I think of that one because we do get a lot of pitches on the South China Sea. And that's sort of a large subject. That's an encyclopedia entry. That's not a piece, right? So the general dynamics of what's happening there, that's for somebody else. Maybe that's for Doyle. That's not for us. For us, it's, I'm going to make up something that I hope is implausible, despite the fact that this is 2020. Japan dropped a nuclear bomb on one of China's, newly created islands. Okay, that's a headline. And that's when we want to know what you know about the South China Sea and how it's applicable to Japan's startling use of a nuclear weapon on China. I'm going to shut up.
So I think I want to circle back to something that I'm pretty sure EJ said early on, and that others I think have probably also echoed, which, just to start with, the importance of knowing the submissions guidelines for the place that you're pitching. A lot of places will tell you, if you don't hear back from us within 48 hours, you can assume that we're passing. And as we all know, especially right now, we're all connecting virtually. Everybody has so many more messages and you're checking things on multiple platforms. I think everyone I know is working really, really hard and really long hours. And we're like, every editor I know is actively trying to get back to everyone as quickly as we can. I would say, you know, when you think about something like the South China Sea or other topics, you know, some of what's happening is there's an event in the news and you recognize, okay, I have something to say about this. And then, you know, whether it's if you're writing a prescriptive piece or you're writing an analysis piece, and if you'll forgive me a slight aside, in terms of thinking about the difference between the two, I would say absolutely, you know, the analysis piece is the how and why, how to think about something, why a certain thing happens, why a certain thing is not likely to work. You don't really need to get into opinion to explain to people why a policy would or would not work. You know, what's the outlet that you're writing for, and when do you think they would publish it? If you're writing something that's not going to work a day later or 6 hours later, I think a question would be, do you have the kind of relationship with that outlet or with an editor there that you can expect they're going to get back to you and they're going to want to publish this thing in the very narrow window in which it works? Or should you be looking at kind of the event in the news that's triggering you, or, you know, whatever the relevant topic is, and saying, okay, I'm going to use this as a hook to talk about this research or this thing, and writing it in a way that would actually last for a couple of days. So I think as you're pitching something, you want to think about where you're sending it, why you're sending it to that audience. Have you written it in a way that, like, it's not going to expire after 3 hours if they're not able to get back to you quickly? I mean, I have certainly pitched things as a freelancer. I have dealt with writers for a long time. It is absolutely, completely true that a fast no is nearly as good as a yes, because we know that you want to be able to move on to the next outlet. We don't want to hold you up. You know, just because your piece doesn't necessarily work for our particular outlet doesn't mean that it's not a good idea, or that, you know, we wouldn't like to see it out there. Maybe we have other pieces that are also coming on that topic, or, you know, just for whatever reason, it doesn't work for our mix. I want to really stress the part where, like, I'm pretty sure most editors they're not actively not trying to get back to you. I will say, I want to speak on behalf of editors here and say, please don't be that person who sends a pitch at 11 p.m. and then sends a new version at 6 a.m. and then follows up again at 8:30 and says, are you taking my piece? Are you taking my piece? Are you taking my piece? Like, look at the submission guidelines and understand, okay, they said they'll be back to me in 24 to 48 hours. They ask for exclusive submissions or not exclusive submissions. And if you're actually dealing with a place that doesn't ask for exclusive submissions, you can email multiple editors at the same time, but know whether the place that you're pitching is asking for exclusive submissions. And if they are, be prepared to send them your piece and then wait a day or however long it is before you start to follow up. I think it's a really, you know, it's a good rule of thumb, and it's just kind of common courtesy to give someone a reasonable amount of time to read your thing and get back to you. I mean, during the time that we've been on this call, we've probably all gotten several messages, but because we're having this discussion, we're not also reading those emails at the same time. So, you know, someone might similarly be in a conference call or on a panel, or just, you know, trying to have a little time away from the computer. It's not that they're not trying to get back to you, but they also need to have time to, like, get through those messages and then circle back. In terms of journalists reaching out, I do think, you know, Twitter threads can be invaluable for surfacing ideas. I would encourage everyone, once you've published something, to share your piece, share it like multiple different ways. Don't just keep sharing the same headline. Pick out different points that you think are interesting about it and tweet it different ways. Send it to people you know in the circles in which you work and ask them if they'll help you share it. You know, you want your signal to cut through the noise. So part of what is, like, really useful about engaging in conversation with people on social media, and I would suggest, you know, just really stick to the merits of the discussion, is just the ability to get ideas out there and kind of refine them and sort of have those conversations. When journalists are contacting you, asking about information on background, to that, I would just say, you know, if you have some question about what does on background mean to them, ask, what are the terms of this conversation? Like maybe it's just a person who's trying to, you know, become informed about something, but they can't promise to cite you or cite your research, but they'd like to be more educated. It seems like that would potentially be a useful conversation just in terms of helping them understand the subject better. If you're a little bit worried for some reason about the conversation, just say, I would just say, like, why wouldn't this be on the record? So, like, I would just ask.
Perfect. I'm gonna get 2 more questions. Renu and also Kaylee.
Yeah, thank you. Question I had since we're talking about pitches. Well, I guess first, thank you all so much for organizing this, for all of you for speaking to us. What is your ideal pitch? Like, I just was kind of wondering if you had thoughts on that. We've talked a lot about, you know, how to format our writing for the articles, but I just was wondering if you had thoughts and preferences and advice on pitches themselves.
And then Kaylee, do you still have a question?
My question was pretty similar to Emma's about balancing timeliness versus the substantive content of the policy. So feel free to not delve back into that topic, but I guess I would be interested in tips about when an event is now making some of your insight like relevant enough to warrant a pitch per se, but it's not, it's either not an ideal case, or it might be really complicated, or we don't know too much about it that you would normally want to have for an academic piece. You'd want to be able to investigate it further. So if you had tips about how to use the timeliness of the event and the details that you know about the event to say something more substantive about it, but it's not necessarily straightforward enough to investigate it further. I hope that made sense. So I can clarify it if not.
Yeah, do any of the panelists want to take a first stab at either of those?
So I'm going to try to restate the second part of your question, and I may have gotten it wrong. And if so, please cut me off and tell me. It sounds like what you're saying is there's an event that is relevant to the work that you're doing, but it isn't necessarily something where the immediate urgency and relevance of it jumps out at someone else. You see the connection with your work and you want to make that there. Is that accurate? So I think that's sort of the ideal kind of pitch for War on the Rocks, for example, or an ideal, if it's a longer form piece, spur to write it as a scholarly article for a policy relevant academic journal like TNSR. It can be a little bit harder because if you're going to try to pitch it to something that is more tied up in the daily headlines, you're going to lose half of your length explaining why it's tied up in the headline. And that's possible, but it then reduces the amount of space that you have available to develop the argument.
I'll jump in as well. So I've done this a number of times where I've had an argument that I've wanted to make, and either because of the timing in my research, when I sort of had the result, it didn't fit in the news cycle, it was unlikely to get published. But later I sort of kept an eye out for events where my research might speak to that. And I'll give one example. About a year ago, I had done some surveys looking at how statements by veterans would impact public opinion on the legitimacy of the mission at the border. And when we, started this survey, it was cutting edge, it was fresh. And by the time we got our results back and we were in a position to publish something, the moment had passed and there was no chance that we were going to publish anything on this topic. But we knew we had something to say about this broader trend of politicization, both how a political leader like President Trump would use the military, but also how they'd respond. And so we mostly charted out and had a rough outline of the ideas. It wasn't a completely written piece, but it was some key themes that we would make if we found the right event. And then on June 1st with Lafayette Square, when General Milley walked with President Trump for the photo op, we made the connection and said, you know, our research on the border isn't exactly this, but it does talk to this dynamic. And so we made I think a 3-sentence or 4-sentence pitch to War on the Rocks and said, you know, we saw Millie do this. We have research about this that we think speaks to this problem. Here's why we're good. Here's why we're the right people to write about it. And we got feedback, and they actually wanted to publish it very quickly because it was very timely. And we turned a piece around in less than 24 hours. So that's not typical, but I would say lots of times, going back to the South China Sea example, you may have something relevant to say, but you do need a good hook or the right moment to publish it. And so be willing to be a little patient with that, and actively look for opportunities, but also be in a position where you could respond quickly if the opportunity shows up.
And it's 2020. If you write about bad things, it's going to happen again.
Did any of the other panelists want to jump in on any of these questions before we turn to our next question?
I think it was interesting. The question was about pitching, and you know, the same way that you look at submission guidelines for particular outlets, I think doesn't War on the Rocks ask for pitches, whereas the Post would, if you already have a draft, we'd much rather have you send the draft of the piece rather than sort of have some back and forth about whether you should or shouldn't write. Like, we're not going to be able to give you an answer without seeing the text of the piece itself. So I think sometimes if you know that you're interested in saying something, you're pretty sure, like, you know what you want it to look like, you could go ahead and write it and send it out, and then just be prepared to either wait if you've sent it someplace that, you know, asks for exclusive op-ed submissions, or, you know, start tweeting your views, and perhaps an editor will see like that thread and then reach out to you and say, hey, could you turn this into a piece for us?
Perfect. So I'll grab the next 2 questions. Naomi first, followed by Jim.
Thanks so much to all the panelists for the really, really helpful insights. I had a question that's mostly for Autumn, but for anyone who wants to answer it as well. And it's about the difference between writing for a generally policy audience versus writing for a broader public audience, like with the Post opinion section or other national or regional newspaper opinion sections, and sort of whether there are different considerations or things to include or not include in the pitch or the piece itself. If you're writing for sort of a more general public interest, public engagement type audience versus the readers of Lawfare or War on the Rocks or things like that.
And then Jim Goldgeier, do you want to jump in with your question?
Great, thanks. This has been so helpful. I have a question for EJ. You mentioned Kyrgyzstan earlier. So, you know, when we look at Kyrgyzstan, I mean, there are a bunch of, I can imagine a bunch of different types of pieces. You know, there's the, oh my God, like, wait, what is all this footage from Kyrgyzstan? Where is it and what's happening? I can imagine gosh, you know, we talked a lot about Ukraine and Georgia, and now wait, there's something going on in Belarus, and there's a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh, and now there's a thing in Kyrgyzstan. Like, there's stuff linking all of this together. And why is the former Soviet Union, you know, having all of this 3 decades after it broke apart? And I can also imagine the sort of, you know, what are the challenges to Putin arising from all this stuff happening all at the same time? And so I'm just curious, I mean, you know, Kyrgyzstan's a small place and it's far away, and you know, there's not a huge amount of US interest in it. I mean, like how many different types of pieces would you run on this, and how would you sort out the differences among these different types of angles about this specific event?
First, I need to tell everybody that Jim is a special case. You have written for us so many times on such short notice that you're considered one of our like go-to people. So I think if you pitched us, you already know the specific editors. I mean, we are now asking everybody to go through the front door with monkeycageblog@gmail.com because we were getting too much duplication when it was all coming in through individual editors. But I think in this case, we would from someone like that, from someone we know knows our format and generally knows what we're looking for, we'd look for you to give a couple of ideas and we'd run it through the appropriate people, and they would say, you know, X is, that's too specialized point of view, and Y, I think you can have trouble with that because the research is iffy, but Z, let's go with Z. As far as Kyrgyzstan, I say it partly because it's such a fun way to tease my fellow editor, Vanessa, because she can't spell it. And as soon as I saw it hit the headlines, I was like, something's coming for you. I just want you to know it's coming. I don't know what we would actually run on it. It's a headline, so there are going to be people who are Googling it. Given where we are in this particular historical moment, Americans are pretty much reading about nothing but the election, right? We've got like almost no readership on other things, although there's the occasional piece, the Kuwaiti Emir. We got a lot of readership on the succession in Kuwaiti Emir, I assume because there's lots of people in the English-speaking world who have money tied up in the Gulf. Kyrgyzstan, I don't know. I just know that usually we would probably run one piece on it. With the Belarus protests, we got maybe 10 pitches, and I think we ran 3. We do hit a saturation point at a certain point. Either it starts receding, so like the Googling opportunity goes away fast if it's a stan. Or if it's not one of the major South American countries or whatever it is, we need to run it fairly quickly. If it's an African country, the people who are going to read about it are pretty much a set portion of the policy universe. It's not going to get much general readership. It's going to get those 350 people or 570 people in the State Department and wherever, no matter when we run it. So those, you know, what I'm saying is it varies. It varies on the news hook. It varies on what else is going on. Pitch us, send us your best ideas on what you think most matters. And maybe someone will say yes, and maybe we'll be too overwhelmed with, you know, that Japanese nuclear bomb. You know, it's going to depend on what's happening in the moment. I can't give,
Eric. Yeah, that's great.
I can't give a firmer answer. Also, just our post-Soviet editor just went off on a year's sabbatical, so we have a different level of interest now. Yeah.
Eric, can I just mention one thing, just following up something that EJ said, which is, I mean, I've often been asked by Elizabeth Saunders or Henry Farrell, not just if I could do something that afternoon, but if I knew of somebody that they could reach out to who could do something that afternoon. And, you know, if like I were to give them your name, I mean, you're going to have to decide, do you want to be that kind of person who says, sure, I'll drop everything else and get this done in the next couple hours, or not? And, you know, I mean, some people are happy to do that and some people aren't, but you know, you should think about that as you go along in your career as to how comfortable you are with doing that. And you know, I do try to drop everything I have for Elizabeth and Henry, but you know, not everybody wants to do that.
Does anyone have a response to Naomi's question by any chance?
Actually, can I say 2 things? Sorry. So one, I hope that everyone heard the broader response in what EJ just said in reply to Jim's question. And that was not only the specifics of, you know, this particular pitch on Kyrgyzstan. And I feel like I heard either 1 or 2 op-eds in that, which is, you know, sort of what's going on that all of these former Soviet republics are like having these, you know, breakdowns right now. And or like if that could be its own thing, or look at this string of basically like mini explosions and what does this mean for Putin. But EJ's response was like a really excellent walk through what are the different considerations that an editor would give to a pitch. And so I hope that people heard not just she was listening to the specific thing that Jim said, but she's thinking about what is our timing? Who is our staffing? Are people going to be Googling this for the next few days? How would we frame this? When would we get it up? Like all the different kinds of things that might lead an editor to say to you, you know, this one isn't right for us right now, but I hope you'll come back in the future. Or, you know, thanks, we can't do it, but I wish you the best in placing it elsewhere. Like there's just any number of considerations that might happen when you pitch something somewhere. And I think as you read places, and I'm assuming that most people are going to be pitching things to outlets that they read, you know, you might notice reading lawfare articles that sometimes go very, very deep on a particular topic, that they're really hoping that some of those points will read, you know, the very specific policymakers who are involved in, you know, very fine, nuanced details. And I think sometimes if like some of those like really longer articles resonate with a very narrow audience, as opposed to having a bunch of clicks among a general audience, they're happy because they have served their core audience. So it's kind of really a question of who are you writing for as you're pitching something? I think this kind of gets to Naomi's question of, okay, so if you're pitching a general audience versus policymakers, that I think guides a little bit about how you think about the writing. What do you need to educate people about versus what level of sort of baseline understanding can you assume that an audience might come in with? So, you know, there might always need to be certain things that you will fill in or explain, but for a policy audience, you might have just more detail that for a general audience, the editor might come back and say, okay, I feel like this part is getting into the weeds. Let's go a little bit higher altitude and tell us, you know, what's the takeaway from this? Like maybe we're not going to explore the finer points of the law or the significance of this particular aspect of the history, but like what's the high level thing to pay attention to? So it's kind of, what's your goal with the article? You know, and sometimes you might find as you're, you know, tweeting something, what you really want is to tell people, hey, I'm doing research about this and I, you know, had these findings and it's really interesting. Sometimes your goal might be, actually, I know something about this and I really want to warn people that this potential policy that's under consideration is not going to work. And here's why. Like, why are you writing this thing? And when you know why you're writing it, and I'm just going to say, like, this may not work for every editor, but certainly a lot of writers might sometimes just feel like, I want to say something. Well, okay, but what's the thing you want to say? And then why are you trying to say it in that particular outlet for that particular audience? And then that will come back to probably, you know, show up in how and why you put together the words that you do.
Awesome. So we've got about 5 minutes left.
Oh, Eric, I just want to add one little thing based on that. I know that as a writer and sort of freelance curious person, sometimes I think about a subject and I think I need to know everything I can about whatever that is for myself. And this little piece, I bet they'd be interested in at the Boston Globe op-ed page where I know an editor. And I mean, I'm old, so I've developed a lot of different editors, but so, you know, I can think, you know, so-and-so at The Nation is going to be interested in this angle of it. And just as Autumn was saying, sometimes the audience is the policy audience. You want to publish it in Democracy Journal because you want to be able to go into every little detail so they know exactly how to write the law. You're thinking Senate staffers, as Doyle was talking about before. And sometimes you want to be able to tell your cousin, the dentist, here's why what that retired general just said is really significant. It means more than you think it means. And then you're going to write it for us, you know, because their cousin, the dentist, is one of our readers. So you can take the same subject. I mean, Jim just came up with his 3 topics and think this piece would be for so-and-so, this piece would be for so-and-so, and this piece would be for so-and-so. I mean, if you have that kind of time, I know you guys all have busy lives. But if you're that interested in that subject, you can do that, but be sure to let every editor know what you're doing, right? Whichever one you start with, say, now, would you mind if I did this other angle for so-and-so?
So we've got about 4 minutes, 3 questions left. So what I'm going to ask Polina, Summer, and Sana to do is to just very, very briefly ask their question. And then we'll go around and have essentially each of the panelists have about a minute or two to kind of answer the questions and to provide their closing thoughts. So with that, Polina, followed by Summer, and then Sana.
Thank you. So my question is about accounting for particular risks or costs of doing policy writing for your future research, specifically access to subjects or interlocutors. Because today you write about how pro-government militias in Ukraine are a threat to civilian control, and then they Google your name before the interview, and you're like, yeah, you're that lady who wrote that we're a threat to, we don't know what exactly, but we don't want to talk to you.
Great.
Summer.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being with us. My question is about sort of the aftermath of publishing policy writing. So I know many of you, your social media teams ask authors to follow up with any information about, inquiries from journalists, podcast interviews that come out of policy pieces. So sort of in relation to Emma's earlier question, I think the challenge for many authors, especially new authors, is remembering that you're not in a classroom or giving a conference talk when you're doing that kind of engagement in different media. And I wonder if any of you have advice or experience in advising people on this.
And Sana.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for a fantastic and interesting panel. So I have a little bit of a question beyond the reality of news events and what's happening in terms of the sequencing of doing policy relevant research. So what is the right time for us that are all involved in like multi-year projects to start publishing policy relevant pieces from our work? Thank you.
So I want to take this in reverse order of the folks that we started out with. So Tanvi, I will let you have the first final word.
So to the last question, first, get your dissertation done. That's your priority. Take the stuff that's in your dissertation. Think even about kind of policy audience as a bit of a break. It gives your mind a break from what you're doing. It also helps you feel kind of more connected sometimes to the real world. So I would say, focus on what your primary job is to turn into a done dissertation rather than the perfect dissertation, and use that information as, and this is connected to what EJ said, which is you can use the same stuff for different outlets. On the question of the Polina, so I think it's a really important question that I think you never stop dealing with. And one of the things, especially people don't often think this about me, I can be quite introverted. You're putting your work out there, and you're putting opinions out there. And it is, going to get all sorts of feedback. Now, in some cases, you're working on things that are quite sensitive, that could even be challenging or dangerous. And that's a whole different set of considerations. And that's something that you have to be aware of in terms of the consequences of what you're putting out there. I have to think about it constantly, not so much in a kind of, is it a dangerous sort of way, but I do recognize that I can be a lot more flip on Twitter. My articles are, when I write an article or piece, is quite serious. I nitpick. The War on the Rocks editor is probably frustrated with how long I take to turn stuff in, but I nitpick about every word I write. But on Twitter, I'm quite flip. Now, I have to be careful that I only started being more myself on Twitter, that I have a sense of humor, etc., after I've kind of semi-established myself with my work. And so for me, that's the consideration. There's also considerations like I have to work in an environment, the people I'm interviewing are often, in India and Asia, where there's still a sense that if you're coming from American think tank, you must be kind of a CIA-funded person, and what are your, your motivations are questions. What's your agenda here? And so I have to deal with those kind of things. And so I have to be careful, especially when I'm engaging in social media, rather than my writing where I tend to be. So I think it's to be a very different set of questions for folks who are working on countries where this is a more fraught issue. And perhaps there are others who can answer that. But I think it is important to think about how you balance these. I think you have to, and this is why I also say, when you're engaging on social media, in conferences, anywhere, be respectful. I have been really disappointed to see very smart people who I did have a lot of respect for get into kind of mean, exchanges on Twitter. I'll say this to folks, and especially when you're coming out of academia, there's a sense to think about policymakers and policy audiences as somehow less knowledgeable, sometimes even stupid. And some things can come across as condescending, just like they should have, and you want them to respect you, show respect for them. They are, most of the time, I would say 98%, 95% of the time, they're making tough choices. There are no perfect choices. In hindsight, or for those of us sitting on the outside, they might be easy calls. So, just like these days, very quickly, I'll say, people are debating, China, US, rapprochement, and things like that. For me, it's like, question the assumptions and the arguments. Don't go and say you were mean, or you wanted to do business, or you wanted to, have access, and therefore you have this opinion. So I just say, think about it, not just because of how it might redound to your kind of views of you in terms of, how you're generally seen. I think do it just because it's a good thing to do in what is essentially a very small field in any case.
Well, thanks so much. I'm cognizant of everyone's time. I realize that some people have to jump out. So I guess we'll go to Jim next, and then if folks just want to kind of have a few final words, that'd be fantastic.
Great. I'll try to be quick. I will just say, Paulina, there are risks and costs of your public profile. And so I would just, whether you're tweeting or whether you are writing, realize there's a permanent record, and think hard about whether or not the things you're doing align with your long-term incentives. As someone who is critical of senior leaders in the US military, but still wants to have some policy influence, I have dealt with that in good and bad ways. It's different in an international context, but if you can come across as an honest broker who is bringing policy analysis, I think you can prevent yourself from being closed off of a lot of topics. On journalists, I would just say, know the ground rules up front and keep things within your areas of expertise, and resist the urge to jump from one area of expertise to a topic that's unrelated, that journalists sometimes will try to make you do. I have a friend who published or who posted their APSA working paper that was on norms of cadets at West Point, and the journalist wanted to tie this paper on this very specific question to what happens if Trump, refuses to lose after the election. They weren't connected, and they had to be very clear. You're stretching this research to a point that is not my intention, and that I don't think fits it. So understand those ground rules up front, and resist the temptation to, just draw eyeballs. Last thing on sequencing, I would just say, with a dissertation, I would say get it done first. With future projects, I would be a little bit more thoughtful about how you do it. So we have a book project that won't come out till next year. We had 2 surveys, one last summer, one this summer. We published 2 articles out of our initial research last summer. One was War on the Rocks, one was The Atlantic. We plan to do 2 or 3 this year. We think it's an interesting topic, and it will sort of broaden the policy discussion leading up to it. But if I were writing a dissertation, if I were writing a dissertation, I would hold off until I got it done probably. So just again, think about what it is, why you want to engage with the public, and what the benefit of doing so is before you do it.
Perfect. Doyle, over to you.
Sure. So I think echoing what others have said about the risks, being an honest broker, protecting your sources, and then considering the timing. If it's sources that you need access to complete your dissertation or hit some other milestone, then don't put it out until you no longer need access to that, understanding that you can't control whether those sources cut off access after that point. You can only control your actions from there. In terms of managing the aftermath, in terms of that, the contact from journalists, that sort of stuff, I think Jim's spot on. The other thing I would ask is when you retweet it, and please do retweet it, please, if you have concerns with how the editorial process went, the retweets aren't a great place to do that. Please share those with us privately. Yeah, we all always like the sort of throwaway, hey, it was great working with them. That's nice. That's always nice to hear. I'm okay without those too, but it's frustrating if I get commentary on, well, this isn't exactly what, please have that conversation with me offline. I'm happy to have it. On the question of the right time, the one dissent I'll give, I think the advice from Tanvi and Jim is wise. The one thing I'll say is that I know that for myself, I found myself at times where I was stuck, and sometimes working on a shorter piece can be a way to work through being stuck and develop an idea that may help you to work through that sticking point in your dissertation project. But obviously, don't allow those side projects to distract from the goal that you've got to achieve. Use them in a way that is productive to what you need to do. The last thing I'll throw in, and I'll include the link here in the chat, is I would just like to point out to folks and invite them to participate in the Jan Nolan Prize competition, which is being sponsored jointly by the Kissinger Center at SAIS and also Texas National Security Review. It's for new scholarship by young or early career scholars on any topic in national and international security. In addition to the opportunity to be published in TNSR, I think one of the great benefits is the opportunity to workshop it with some tremendous scholars. I had someone ask me, hey, well, why wouldn't I just submit it to TNSR all along? I think the answer is workshopping with folks of this caliber allows you to develop your argument into the best possible argument that it can make, and also to develop a terrific network of people who will work with you and help you to mentor along the stuff that you want. So I'm happy to answer questions on it, but I would love to see submissions from everyone who's participating here. Thanks.
Perfect. EJ.
I'm sorry. I don't think I have any last words. I think I've said all my words. Yeah.
Autumn, any last words from you?
I think this has been a really great discussion. I would urge everyone, especially when you're looking at edits, on a piece that you've sent in, if you have questions about something, and this sort of gets to something Doyle just said, ask them. I mean, good editing is not about making writing sound like the editor's voice. The editors are trying to be advocates for both the writer and the reader. They generally can explain to you probably pretty quickly like why they're changing something. Everyone is, working quickly and has high volumes right now, so they might not be spelling out precisely when they send something back to you, here's why I changed this, here's why I cut that. But especially if you notice something and you're wondering about it, totally ask, and they should be able to tell you. And it is so much better to ask before something is published. Always ask, if you have any concerns, what's the headline on my piece? If you don't like it, as I think came up in the chat earlier, sharing it with a tweet that says, I don't really like the headline on this, but please, share it anyway. That's not really useful. Go back to the publication and say, here's why this headline is inaccurate, or here's why I have concerns about it. Your name is on it, so they can probably explain really quickly, here's what we were thinking about it. Nobody wants to publish an inaccurate headline, or one of you had also had an experience with an inaccurate photo. That could have just been, it wasn't my error, so I don't know what happened, but honestly, like, none of us wants to get something wrong. So when you see something that's problematic, say something. I'm sure, editors want you to have a good experience, as well as they want to publish an accurate piece. So just speaking up can really, take care of issues.
Well, thanks so much to all of our panelists. I know I definitely learned a lot, and we have these every year, but every single time I go to one, I learn a lot more. And so thank you all for taking the time to be here. And also thank you to all of the attendees. Before we close, I want to turn the floor over to Naz Barma, one of our directors, to have the actual final words.
Thanks, Eric. I'm just going to take 30 seconds here to say thank you. First to Catherine for making it so that none of us had to worry about the technology because she did. Thank you. Second to Eric for being an exemplary moderator and keeping the conversation flowing as he did. Third to EJ, Autumn, Doyle, Tanvi, and Jim. This was an extraordinary panel. We've been putting these together for more than 15 years, and the combination of the different perspectives, the nuance, the honesty, the insights, really just so grateful to all of you for joining us here. I'm sure the participants will thank me. I mean, the participants learned something, I'm sure, but all of the fellows and directors did too. Thank you. I want to mention Jim Goldgeier, Bruce Gentleson, Brent Durbin, and Jordan Tama were all on at different points. So we were in full force in terms of the director team as well. And thank you to the fellows, Rachel, Danny, Sarah, Eric, and Andrew for putting together such an extraordinary panel. We will see you guys on Friday, 10 a.m. Eastern. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, for the panel on careers. We look forward to it. And thanks again to our panel. Really appreciate your time and contributions today.